Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to present to you this debate on the greater subject of the social justice movement, which so afflicts our societies today. My chosen interlocutor for this is the inimitable Mr. J.T., who goes by the epithet of the Laughing Ogre, and to whom I generally refer as Mr. Ogre.
I am the Laughing Ogre, and I'd like to thank the Britisher for coming up with this wonderful idea of this cyber debate, this pre-planned thought process where we exchange ideas from across the pond. And if you're ready for me to jump up and down and get red-faced and to start to scream and yell and go all Alex Jones on you, you might want to just swing by my normal channel. I'm sure you can find a vid or two like that. You can also find some that are even-keeled and we'll talk about political issues. That said, grab yourself a cup of tea, maybe a cuppa, coffee, get your butt on the settee, and prepare for a discussion about social justice warriors and the destructive force they represent.
A link to Mr. Ogre's very worthwhile YouTube channel you may find in the notes, ladies and gentlemen. This is a remote debate, so not a live video. So both of us taking part have had some time to reflect before lodging our respective questions and answers. Regular viewers of my channel will no doubt observe that JT is, to my particular sensitivities, painfully American. What can I say? This is the first debate of this kind I am putting together. One cannot be too demanding. But previous record would suggest that this fellow is quite level-headed. Just do not mention gun laws, cars with fewer than 8 cylinders, or whether you think American football is a sport or not. To make it worse, Mr. Ogre is a practiced voiceover man, who has little apprehension at talking into a microphone without notes. I, on the other hand, am still much more of an amateur, so in order to prevent my spouting absolute drivel, or freezing into complete silence, I will consult my extensive script. Mr. Ogre, meanwhile, being the incorrigible show-off that he is, will be speaking freely. One day I hope maybe to possess a fraction of Mr. Ogre's fluency, but I am realistic enough to realize that that day is not today. However, I will try to be a little looser in my approach, given the circumstances. So, best to dive right in. Mr. Ogre, do you think that followers of the social justice movement will ever grow out of it? Like hippies and punks who grew old in the past, had kids, did the 9-to-5 routine, or started businesses? Or is this some disease from which we think people do not recover? Do you think that with greater maturity they settle down and become productive members of society? Or is this a part of the millennial generation which has been lost for good, poisoned by ideology?
That's a really good question. And I do believe it is an issue of how developed someone is, how mature a person is. Because let's face it, you know, if you can take yourself back to the playground at school when you were young, who were the quote-unquote social justice warriors then? It was all the Nancy boys. It was all the girls that liked to fruff up and put on makeup. The tomboys that climbed trees and the tough boys that wanted to arm wrestle and play dodgeball or cricket. They were always too busy doing those things. And these less mature, less confident kids would always worry about what the other more confident and tougher kids were doing. And, you know, you can't play dodgeball that way. You can't arm wrestle that way. You shouldn't be fighting. You shouldn't be this and that. When it was all kids' games and it should have been left alone. I was somewhat of a punk rock kid. I listened to a different kind of music than my brothers did and than most people around me while they were listening to hair bands like Poison and, I can't even, some of the other ones, and Quiet Riot and the lot. I don't really care much for them, so I can't mention many. I was listening to Depeche Mode and Tears for Fears and a lot of punk rock music, The Clash, The Cure, all of the great English punk rock bands. And I thought at that point that I would never grow out of it, that I would always be a punk rock kid, that I would say "oi" instead of "hey," even though I was an American, and that I would always try to have that Billy Idol sneer on my face. But sure enough, as time passed by, I grew out of it. but we're not talking about the same thing here. We're not talking about so much of a phase as an indoctrination. And I can see that there is what I would consider an arrested development and going on here, that they can't mature because they've been told that the state that they're in is the proper state. So not only is this a difficult question for me to answer, I don't think that the question can be answered. I believe that maturity is part of it, but the terribleness comes in, the insidiousness pervades in the indoctrination of new social justice warriors. And real quickly, I want to also address the idea of the hippies and the beatniks, and it goes all the way back to the Bohemian Grove, because the Bohemian Grove 125 years ago, it wasn't a place where rich businessmen got together to do whatever it is that they do, you decide. It was a place where the local people from around San Francisco that were artists, musicians, poets, you name it, playwrights, players, and the local plays, all these things would get together because a large amount of them were homosexuals, and if not, they were very eccentric. They didn't fit in, and they wanted a place to be where they could fit in. And they came up with some ideas there. And will they grow out? Will it change? Yes, some of the hippies will get a 9-to-5 job. Some of the punks will change and won't sneer anymore and say oi. Some of the things will change. But it's the idea that they pass from one to the other, that our way is the best way. That is up for debate always. That is what I call, and what is called, subjective. It's subject to your thoughts, ideas, and experiences. If it's objective, you can't. That's the way it is. But these things, the social justice warrior insanity, is all subjective thinking that also wants to make you subject to their thoughts and ideas. Thank you very much, Brett. I guess. I have a question for you here. I've often wondered, since you mentioned it the way you did, do you see this social justice phenomenon as a form of arrested development? And if so, what role do you see the education system that you can speak of there in England playing in the indoctrination of new social justice warriors?
Arrested development. It's an interesting thought. I guess you refer to the childlike simplicity with which everything is approached. Also their eternal cry of things being unfair. Equality of outcome is simply taken as a given. Anything which runs counter to that is unfair. I guess it is worth asking whether a certain level of infantilization has taken hold. Not least because there seems to be an out-and-out refusal to deal with the realities of life. In the past we were raised to accept that some things were not as we liked them. We simply needed to deal with it. Whereas now there seems to be so many who simply refuse to accept reality. To them, reality is what it is supposed to be, not what it is. Of course they realize that the world does not accord with their ideal. I am not saying they are that far gone. But what seems clear is that they simply refuse to inhabit reality. They refuse to acknowledge it. They live instead in their bubble. I guess that is why they are so fond of their safe spaces. They wish simply to live within such bubbles and desire to remain untouched by the outside world. Thus they create their own reality. Because to their minds reality is not good enough. One might say it is not worthy of them. It is something dirty, something corrupted, something unclean. Whereas their reality is pure, it is righteous. But to come back to your question, do I see the education system playing its part in this? Yes, of course I do. One feels that the education system is increasingly being seconded into imparting values, rather than just teaching knowledge. It does not help that the education system seems increasingly to be staffed by people with a progressive mindset. And that is only the regular education of which I speak. That prior to university. Once you get to university, we seem to descend down the rabbit hole. To all avail, it appears that certain feminist faculty are running amok and have secured positions of power, which leads other faculty to forgo any attempt at standing up to the madness. Serious indoctrination seems to occur. I have seen it for myself in a young woman I knew, who for most of her time at university seemed a perfectly well-balanced individual. But at some point they seemed to have got a hold of her. All of a sudden attitudes seemed to shift. One seemed to be considering these pre-digested ideas rather than thinking for oneself. Everything needed to be seen through the prism of this progressive doctrine. So much so, she began questioning much of herself in a fairly unhealthy way. This is where I find that these ideas, these concepts, can prove quite poisonous. They can undermine the individual. The person finds themselves obliged to adhere to some bizarre artificial morality, which has no grounding in reality. Should I be doing this? Should I be thinking this? Should I be feeling this? Questioning oneself is a healthy thing, but supplanting one's entire moral and intellectual foundation with progressive thinking makes for a far from positive outcome. It is as though people begin to wonder whether they have permission to think or say this and that, not because they know it to be wrong, but because they have not been told whether it is acceptable. So they become morally indecisive, confused. They rely on some other entity to tell them whether something is right or wrong. In that regard, there is something quasi-religious going on. One refers to academic papers for guidance as though to religious scripture. But I guess that is the high end. At the lower end, I remember at primary school, at the age of 9 or 10, I had a teacher who was making noises which, with hindsight, were clearly feminist doctrine. Later one tried to get me to knit. I am not kidding. Because of course, if women knitted, then so too should the next generation of men. Safe to say, the attempt failed spectacularly. Unless you can teach boys how to knit their own sportswear, they are not going to be interested. But please consider that these attempts were made well over 30 years ago. This was the insanity of the second wave feminists. At that point, though, it was individuals, or groups of teachers. Now it is the education structure itself. It would no longer be a bunch of indoctrinated teachers at some school trying to get boys to knit. No, now it would be an edict by the education authorities. What once was a few basket cases here or there has become the system itself. The children within it stand almost no chance whatsoever. That said, the methods seem to have become considerably more sophisticated. One has learned that trying to force boys to knit will only ever create a backlash. So now they condition people rather more subtly. That said, now it is over a much greater number of concerns. The complete gamut of social justice subjects. They will no doubt couch this in terms of respect and simply decent behaviour. After all, who would be against that? Should it not be the job of teachers to inculcate pupils with decency and respect? But I guess the end result of this is to produce people who are outraged to their core at fairly minor things. Because they have from a very young age been taught that for a man to wolf whistle at an attractive woman is the equivalent of calling someone a nigger, or advocating for the extermination of the Jews. I think much of the appreciation of scale of an insult or a misdemeanour seems to have been lost because of this indoctrination. Everything is the worst. There are no lesser infractions. I guess that too helps provide the impression of arrested development, as you put it. Because it is in children that we usually observe this inability to gauge the severity of something. Everything is either a catastrophe or a blessing, with little or nothing in between. But whether it is truly arrested development, or that we have chosen to develop children differently, I guess is up for debate. But I agree with you that the impression can indeed be that we are confronted with individuals who are mentally still stuck at primary school. Anyhow, I think I have blathered on about this long enough, and it is time to let the ogre expand a little more on something. So, it is often said that mockery of adherence to social justice is the best way of exposing their flawed ideology and their bullying behaviour to the rest of the world. But is it not possibly also causing them to become yet more entrenched? Are the likes of Milo Yiannopoulos, Bering and Undoomed really helping to expose them to the public? Or are they causing the culture wars to become ever more bitter?
I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to mock someone when what they're doing is mock-worthy. Do I think it's the best way to expose flawed ideology and their bullying behavior? It's very difficult for me to say this again. I really appreciate the hard questions that make me think so deeply. I would say fighting fire with fire, it can work if you're making a fire break and you're burning some of the brush and the grass to stop the fire when it gets there. But sometimes fighting fire with fire just gets you burned. I really firmly believe that logical discussion, that deep pondering of these questions is the only solution. There's no way that we're going to out-bully these cry bullies. There's no way we're going to out-mock them. I've experienced it myself. If you don't spell a word properly, you're an idiot. If, and I've been to school, so I'm not going to get into that, but if you don't have a degree in whatever, gender studies, and it don't have to be that. If you haven't been to school and got a master's in something, you're a moron. Let me tell you, the most intelligent people that I've met in my life have never stepped through the hollowed halls of any university anywhere in the world. So, you can take your degree in whatever and $2.75 go to Starbucks and get yourself a small coffee. So, but I'm getting off track. Do I think that bullying and mockery is the answer? No. But it does expose them. It is necessary to a certain extent. They have shown us the way with Saturday Night Live, and I could go on, but they have shown us the way through Laura Dunham and the Schumer, Amy Schumer, that they mock us when it's kind of weird. It's like the moronic kid in class that is really stupid, and then he's mocking you because you're getting an A in social studies in the 8th grade, and you're like, huh? You think I'm stupid because I'm doing my work and I'm trying to get along here and do what I'm supposed to do, and yet you don't know the customs of the island people because you didn't study that chapter, you moron. And it is when I see the mockery that comes from them, it's more than the pot calling the kettle black. And as far as how I feel about Milo and Bering and Undoomed, are they helping to expose them in the public eye? They do something, yes. And they bring this mockery to the forefront, but look at what they're doing to Milo. I think that I might be getting ahead because of the way we did this. I don't want to seem to be like I'm smarter than anybody else because I'm saying things that may not have been in the news when the Britisher made his comment. But you see what they took Bering down for the copyright strikes. Did he use another bear that looked at yes? Did his wife's bear same with the yes? I've looked into it, yes. But they struck him down instead of giving him warnings because they wanted to shut him up. Milo Yiannopoulos, he's out there mocking these people, and he is gay. They called him homophobic. They called him an anti-Semite. He's Jewish and he's gay. They called him racist, and he prefers black gentlemen. All of these things. So what I would say is, I'm good at debate. So I have called out a couple people that my host would be upset if I mentioned them right now. But I've called a couple people out because they are blithering idiots. They would be fools to come onto my turf and to debate me because it would make me look good and would make them look stupid. That said, what kind of a fool is Milo? And I love Milo. I love him. He is my favorite gay man on earth. I would kiss him in public. But what kind of fool is he to try to attack the master when you are but the student? It's futile. The master will not only win, the master will humiliate you. And what they're doing right now to Milo, when I seen him in that press conference, and his eyes were down, and his voice wavered with sadness, the first time that I've ever seen in my life of being one of his followers and watching his stuff, it broke my heart. And that showed me the answer to this question. Should we mock? Yes. Should we make fun of? Yes. And expose? Yes. But we should also realize that we are the students at this. We use reason and logic. They use feelings and mockery. I believe that we should stay away from the feelings and mockery. So, Britisher, I have a question for you. It seems to me in my studies that this goes back way further than most people would realize. So if you could take a moment, Britt, and just tell us what you see or what your studies have led you to believe is the origin of the SJW phenomenon that we see today.
I think at its heart it most likely originated in morality. Essentially all left-wing politics is grounded in morality. I know, particularly to those on the religious right, this might seem preposterous, but the politics of the left is about fairness at heart, and fairness is grounded in our sense of justice, in our sense of what is right and wrong. In that regard, social justice is a deeply moral cause. It seeks to remedy injustice. The problem is that it seeks to remedy largely illusory injustice, but its attraction to people is thus quite clear. It gives them a sense of doing the right thing. I guess going on a demonstration to them is much like a pilgrimage to Canterbury was to medieval English Christians. It is a sacrifice to an ideal, a purifying deed, which of course bestows upon the person executing it a sense of moral superiority. And moral superiority is a very tempting concept. The fact that social justice shares such basic DNA with other left-wing causes is, I guess, why some people refer to it as cultural Marxism. Whereas socialism concerns itself largely with remedying economic injustice, social justice, as the name says, seeks to remedy the social kind. That said, some of the quasi-intellectual underpinnings of this rather creaky structure do seem to be a melange of ideas from various left-wing intellectuals of the past, and are served up as this modern-day social justice concoction. After all, it seems to derive much of its credibility from its academic pretensions. Everything, we are told, has already been worked out by greater minds. None of us need think about this anymore, as it has already been thought through by much cleverer people, people with letters behind their names. If we are lucky, we even get pointed to some academic paper, which in turn proves totally illegible, and makes reference to about 20 or 30 other papers. Thus, even if one were to seek to question that paper, one would merely end up questioning the validity of all those papers, these being simply too numerous and too lengthy, and of course linked to myriad other papers, for a single person to practically read in their spare time. So one has created a ridiculous structure whereby everything cross-references, making it impossible to contradict any point, unless you simultaneously contradict every piece of feminist literature that has ever been written. But I guess in order to apply a little more precision in answering your question, one person to whom people like Christina Hoff Sommers point is Kimberly Crenshaw. She is the mother of the concept of intersectionality, which I guess I would understand to be at the heart of the social justice movement. Because when we speak of this movement, we do not mean feminism or gay rights activism as singular movements. We see it as a coalition of all those movements tied into one, and that is where the concept of intersectional feminism or intersectionality looms large. The origins of this hideous concoction we call the social justice movement seem to lie within feminism, which under Kimberly Crenshaw came up with a theory which allowed them to first tie race and sex together as issues, and then to follow on by including ever more subjects. Thus they successfully created a multi-issue leviathan out of various single-issue groups. They subsumed several movements into one, convincing each that if they stood solidaric, their influence would be multiplied exponentially. In turn, they not only subsumed those movements, but the entire political left. Perhaps they are best compared to some sort of aggressive multinational corporation, which merges with and takes over other companies. In the end, there is only one corporation left. Social justice, intersectionality, identity politics. It does not really matter what you wish to call it. It was the monster that ate all the other movements. It claims ownership of every such movement. The cry goes, "We are about justice." So if your movement or charity is about justice for this or that, then you are part of us, because we want justice for all. It sounds lovely, except that we know that there are inherent conflicts. The second-wave feminists are incompatible with the demands for transgender identity rights. The Muslim rights advocates clash with just about all others within the movement. Some gay issues clash with feminist issues. It seems a house built on contradictions. All the while it demands that society deal with the issues it highlights, but refuses to acknowledge other issues. Some black communities are rampantly anti-Semitic and violently disposed toward gays, but such issues confuse the message, so they are conveniently ignored. The fact that society is messy, that there are no victim groups who are pure as the driven snow and free of all sin, only sinned against, such truth is rejected. Instead we get these patriarchal constructs of oppression, wherein everything is perfectly clear, and all is the fault of the white man, and those who would collaborate with him. Anyway, I think I have once again more than exhausted my time. So let me put this to you, Mr. Ogre. Do you think this phenomenon has peaked? Many thought that the advent of Trump hailed the demise of the social justice phenomenon, but since his election they have been frantic. Rarely have they made so much noise. Some think this is due to their panicking, as they see the writing on the wall, but others feel it is that Trump has given them their bogeyman, and has thus put even more fire in their bellies, having given them further impetus, further inspiration. How do you see it?
I mean, I gotta kind of laugh at that. Do I think it's peaked? No, I think it's hitting its stride. I believe that right now it's gaining momentum, that it had potential energy sitting at the top of that mountain, and now the kinetic energy is mounting as that boulder is rolling downhill, and if you prefer, that snowball rolling downhill, gathering more and more inertia as it rolls toward the little cottage of humanity at the base of that mountain. I don't think it's peaked. I think that if we don't do something about it, that it's going to ruin our society. Did Trump, listen, just because one person, Trump in this instance, just because he is an anti-social justice warrior, just because he's a true alpha male that says what's on his mind without apologies, has that helped? Yes, that's helped. But come on, anybody that thought that, like I've looked at some of the satirical art by Ben Garrison. If you don't know who he is, check out Ben Garrison. He has some really funny artwork. And, you know, it shows Trump as a lion and all the lion tamers and stuff around him, and Jeb Bush, and he's beating him up, and his social justice warriors, he's flinging them around. And then there's another one where he's like a knight with a sword, and he's got his foot on the dragon, and the dragon is SJW. Come on, folks. There is no St. George coming to slay the dragon. That's not what it is. He can do what he can do to set an example, but he's just one man, and I've got to say right now, he is a man. He is not a god. There's nothing fantastically special about him other than now, outside of being a billionaire, real estate mogul, he's also the President of the United States. I'm sure that appeals to his massive id. But I just don't see that there is going to be an end to this through Trump. I do think that Trump has given them a boogeyman to focus on. I mean, I have never in my life, I was so young during the race riots in Detroit and whatnot that I don't remember them. My mother does and my father does, but I wasn't around. Race wasn't an issue until about 2003. That's when it started to rear its ugly head again. Before that, in my life, between 1980, that I can definitely remember, to 2000-ish, there was no race problem in this country. You're crazy. Black folks, white folks, every folk got along. We were the great melting pot. Just like the Brit told me, you know, they have chutney with their tea and sandwiches. And I did a video, look at it, man, and you'll see the Molo. I'm going to butcher his name. You'll see the greatest man to ever step foot on a rugby field. And they have absorbed these cultures, and not that they've done away with theirs in the process, they've absorbed it and made it part of their own. That may have been a little bit in the weeds, but yes, Trump is this boogeyman. He is something that they can focus on. They can go and burn down the Starbucks and beat people's cars up. but I fear that they are poking the bear with a sharp stick. And what all of us need to realize is violence is not the answer, but sometimes it's the solution. And if they continue to poke the bear with the stick, all you have to do is look at the map and ask yourself, city-dwelling leftists, do you really want the bear to wake up and start to bite? Because all of your talk about the majority vote and the popular vote, well, if you were to go after the hinterland the way you are, the hinterland would eat you alive. That said, I don't want my answer to get, too long, even though this, of all of them, it strikes me probably the deepest. It hasn't peaked, and Trump will do nothing to save you. When you grasp that and realize that salvation comes through knowledge, friends, salvation comes through your own logical study of reality and history. That's what will save you. So, Britt, I'd like to ask you, this feminism thing, I just watched an excellent video that you put up, and you had Steve Shivers in there, and it wasn't about feminism, but every time I see him, I can't help but think about it. So that said, how would feminism work, Britisher, if there was no SJW culture to back this insanity of fourth wave feminism? And I want to make clear for our listeners, I don't mean feminism that says that females should be treated as human beings. I mean feminism that says if you're a male, you should die and you're a rapist. So what do you think, Britt? Would there be any feminism if there wasn't this SJW army?
Well, that would not have been much of a problem. Feminism is pretty much at the heart of this. As said, Crenshaw is a feminist. She just happens to be a black feminist, and thus wants to claim double victimhood. But intersectionality sprung from feminism. Never should we forget it. Much of censorship also springs from feminism these days, something also worth keeping in mind. Milo Yiannopoulos called feminism cancerous, and I would agree that feminism is the cancer at the heart of this. The other extensions of social justice are merely the outgrowths of this hideous tumour. They are effectively the movements which have been subsumed by the expansionist dogma from within feminism. We need only look at the personnel. How many Black Lives Matter leaders can you name off the top of your head? How many gay rights advocates? Now try feminists. The names trip off the tongue much more readily, do they not? We have heard of the Anita Sarkeesians and so on. For that is their centre. Feminism is the pseudo-intellectual motor behind it all. And it is around feminism that they will fight as though defending the Alamo. So feminism would do well enough without the social justice movement. It has merely co-opted the other causes in order to give itself more clout. I guess one could say it has subordinated those other causes. One can but wonder what the other movements would make of that thought. But feminism is the original Hydra. The manifold other heads we face nowadays are simply the additional ones the creature has grown. Feminism might be strengthened by the social justice coalition it has created, but to some extent it is also weakened. Maybe this is what you are driving at here, Mr. Ogre. Because of course the so-called progressive stack does not place feminism at the top. Victimhood has become a multi-layered thing, with every group struggling to claim that they are suffering most. I believe it was Dave Rubin who coined the term the Victim Olympiad. You must grant it to the man that it does paint a wonderful mental image of supposed victims grimacing under the strain of trying to be the most victimized of them all. In that regard, feminism would be liberated if it sheds its social justice allies, because it could do away with the progressive stack, and would immediately claim the monopoly of victimhood for itself again. The feminist narrative would no longer be cluttered with false professions of loyalty to this or that other victim group. Feminists could simply return to denouncing the patriarchy with full voice, without having to concede exceptions to black men, gay men, etc. They would also free themselves of the shackle of having to defend Islam and its traditional Middle Eastern outlook on women. So too could they let go of the transgender paradox. So feminism could set itself free again by ditching intersectionality. But in doing so it would cede a great deal of power. If feminism likes to claim to speak on behalf of all women, then as the leader of the social justice pack, it not only makes that claim, but so too claims to embody the interests of all minorities. Politically, that makes for a much more potent weapon. If the female represents just over 50% of the population, then add in all the minorities and you theoretically craft yourself an unassailable majority. That has been the thinking behind the surrender by the political left to this movement. One hoped intersectionality would provide total dominance. After all, we all recall how Clinton supporters proclaimed that the demographics were utterly against the Republicans. Whose demographics? The demographics of Democrat Party supporters? Or the demographics of those over whom intersectionality claims overlordship? In that regard, the political left has deluded itself in letting the social justice movement take over the ship. It believed the propaganda. As champion of social justice, it would get all women's votes, all black votes, all Hispanic votes, all gay votes, all transgender votes, however many dozen that last group actually represents. If you believe the intersectional claim, then of course you believe that you cannot lose. Hillary Clinton did just that. So did the Democrat Party. So did the media. But as we know, the intersectional landslide did not happen. Sure, Clinton won the popular vote, but you look at not only the breakdown of Trump's vote, but so too the sweep of other Republican victories in the state elections, and you realize that people simply did not buy it. A great many blacks, Hispanics and gays did not feel obliged to vote according to social justice doctrine. Neither, of course, did many women, much to Anna Kasparian's apparent chagrin. Time for another question, methinks. Dave Rubin has suggested that with its increasing insistence on dubbing opponents Nazis, that the left is almost inevitably going to descend into violence. He sees the Trump riots and the UC Berkeley incident as proof that this is happening. How do you see this playing out? Is social justice, with its insistence on victim hierarchies and white guilt, almost destined to end in street battles with the police? And if so, what might happen if it does? Could this spark some violent right-wing extremism in response?
You've mentioned a name that's really important to me. Dave Rubin is a very intelligent left-leaning person. I put him right up there with, and Britt, I don't really know. You don't talk to me about your leanings, but I can glean that you are what I would call a classic liberal. So am I. A lot of people mistake me for a conservative. I'm actually an anarcho-capitalist, which you can't get any more liberal than that. But I put Dave Rubin up there with yourself, myself, the hard bastard, some other really good left-leaning people that have a brain. That said, of course calling people Nazis and fascists and all of these words that are so recent in our history, so fresh in our minds, is going to lead to violence. You and I both have looked at a moron that I'm not going to name because we've already given him way too much airtime, that was defending punching people in the face on the street without warning. If you haven't watched that video of his name is eluding me at this moment, Spencer, of him getting punched by this insane lefty out of left field, and I don't care if he's a Nazi. I'm a Jew. Don't come and punch me. Don't come and put me in a gas chamber. Don't do that to my family members or my friends because of what they are or what they believe. That said, don't do it to a Nazi. Don't do it to a real fascist. And these people are the fascists. These are the bundle of sticks, these weak sisters that come together to form something that is rather formidable. I believe the Brit will agree with me. This phenomenon of SJWism, this thing that's going on with people destroying businesses and burning things down and running gay men out of universities, this is much more fearful than a gaggle of morons somewhere in the Middle East with AK-47s they don't know how to use and their holy weapon in their pants, blowing themselves up in the water closet. This is something that we need to think about. This is something much more real. How do I see it playing out? I mean, doggone, when I see the riots over Trump and at UC Berkeley, I see it, man, please, this is not a call to violence on anybody's part. But I said in my last answer, I see them poking the hinterland with a stick. And I see the hinterland rising up and crushing these city-dwelling morons who would be eating rats in 7 days and each other in 30. without the hinterland. If they don't have us, if they don't have our diverse peoples that are out here in the middle of nowhere and don't have all this interaction with folks where they have to worry about a glance or a look or a word, where we can be ourselves, where a black man can still call me a honky. And I've just had it done in a little town I won't name, and I thought it was funny, and I called him the proper response, and we both laughed and slapped our knees and said, why can't we just all get along like the old days? The old days are gone, so we have to look at the new days. And so I believe I did answer the end of the question. Could this spark violence? Yes, but I'm not going to say right-wing, Britt. It's not going to spark right-wing violence. It's going to spark retribution from the class of people that they are unleashing their vitriol upon. I certainly hope that that answered that question. So I have one for you. Maybe I could have saved this for the last, but I'm going to ask you now. In all this insanity, all of this social justice, moronic, mealy-mouthed, simpering insanity, what do you think the end game is? I want to quote something real quick before I let you answer that. Hearken, friends, when freedom fails, the best men rot in stinking jails. And those that cried, appease, appease, are hung by those they tried to please. So, Britt, I kind of give you an insight of what I think. What do you believe the end game is to this SJW insanity?
The end game is very difficult to discern, because if you grant them their demands, the simple truth is they will simply formulate new ones. I mean, homosexuals were once actively discriminated against. If you were gay and you said as much, you could get yourself into serious trouble. Frankly, these people could get the living snot beaten out of them just for being what they were. This is by and large no longer the case, but has that dampened their ardour for campaigning? Or has it in fact further fostered it? What once was a fairly disparate group of people just wanting basic rights has turned into one of the most efficient political lobby groups in Western society. So much so that the prevalence of homosexuals within our societies is wildly overestimated by now. I believe there is a regular survey on this matter, which every time polls between 20 and 25% among the US population. So those surveyed believe that between a fifth and a quarter of the US population are gay, whereas I think the only survey to hand to show a more realistic level was some federal survey in which about 3.5% of the population identified themselves as homosexual. That is quite a discrepancy, and it shows how influential this whole movement has been on public perception. So I think, looking at the bigger picture, this is the sort of overkill which the social justice movement would seek to achieve. Well, to be honest, they would still not rest there. But if they could convince us all that, say, 10% of the population are transgender and so on, I think they would see that as a substantive gain. They would effectively inflate their apparent constituency in order to enable them to press their demands more effectively. So if you forgive my getting completely lost in this point, I guess one could identify two goals. The first, to increase the perception of the scale of the social justice problems. This then directly leads on to their other goal, and that is to get government to enforce laws which lead directly to societal changes. For they clearly do not seem to seek mere societal changes per se. They seek enforcement. If the past has taught them anything, it is that society is fairly resistant to their ideas. Well, their arguments on the whole are not very persuasive, are they? Thus they seek the state to be their enforcer. Here in Britain, government has had a habit of passing laws of which it says in government literature that the proposed legislation is meant to send a message to society. Is that not a lovely turn of phrase? To send a message to society. So this is not a law reflecting what society wants its government to do. No, it is a law which tells society how it ought to be. I do not know if there could be a clearer indication of the modus operandi of the social justice movement. You do not seek to win the populace. You seek to win the government, and then you impose upon the populace. Or to use that lovely government phrase, you send society a message. By law. So first they seek to create a perception of a supposed victim group being much greater than it is. Then they seek to force action to rescue said victims from a hostile society. Where will it end? Where is their end goal? I honestly do not think they have one. Incidentally, I have been working on a piece which addresses the lack of such a goal within feminism. I do not mention this to plug my wares. It is merely that I have been spending time on this area, though rather aimed at feminism specifically. Anyway, I do not believe there is an end goal, because an end goal is a limit to their ambition, and this movement does not seek to achieve something and then disband and go home. Ultimately, I guess, one could say that the goal is the maintenance of the movement itself. It must keep on rolling. Thus, they will keep on pushing forever, unless they are stopped. But stopping them is going to take something. Remember, all they ask is justice. Justice for all. It seems one of those unopposable positions. There was a reason George W. Bush did not pass a Great Surveillance Act, but the Patriot Act. There was a reason Labour dubbed one of the most corrosive laws in post-war history the Extreme Pornography Act. Because who would oppose such a thing? Who opposes patriotism? Who would publicly support extreme pornography? And in turn, who opposes justice for all? Who would be against treating people decently and with respect? Who is for oppression of the female, hatred of gays and blacks? Who? Name yourselves, so we can come for you. So no, I do not think there is an end game. For there to be an end game, there would need to be an acceptance that at some point they had done their work and would need to shut up and go home. It would mean they would need to let go of what power they had acquired. Do we really think that is likely to happen? Anyhow, let me put this to you, Mr. Ogre. Is there a lesson which can be learnt from all this social justice nonsense? How it developed and took hold of institutions and parties? Is this just something which occurred, or are there things which we can learn from it for the future?
You gotta be kidding me. Listen, it's hard for me not to laugh whenever I hear a question like this. Is there a lesson that we can learn from the social justice nonsense? Yes. It's not to let it happen. To keep a weather eye out for it in the future. How did it develop and take hold in institutions and parties? It's easy. It's the fat shaming phenomenon. People need to be shamed when they're fat. People need to be shamed when they're lazy. I need to be shamed at times for things that I do. Should we not shame a rapist? Should we not shame a murderer or a thief? These are things that hurt other people. If you love someone and they're obese, you should shame them a wee bit if you love them, because you don't want them to die. And in our country right now, obesity has taken over cigarettes as the #1 preventable cause of disease. I have to take a deep breath and sigh, because this stuff hurts my very soul. It's insidious the way they get in. They get in by saying, we want to do something good for you, just like Adolf Hitler. He had the first non-smoking program. He had the first stop smoking campaign of any government. He didn't want people to drink. He wanted them to be healthy for the Reich. He wanted them to have a sharp mind for the Reich, not for them. And that's what the mislead, that's the where they are using the subversion, if you will. Because they say that they want to do this to help you be a better person. They don't want you to say nigger. They don't want you to say spick. They don't want you to say kike. They don't want you to say nothing, honky. They don't want you to say limey. They don't want you to say these things because they want to help these people. That's nonsense. They don't give a crap because we're all Negroes to these people. We are all on a plantation. We are all slaves and only useful idiots in their minds. To me, they're not useful, but they're the idiots. There's nothing we can do if we don't look at it through a dry eye. And to quote, I believe it was Based Mama, take off the rose-colored glasses. It may have actually been Rachel Richardson that said that. Take off the rose-colored glasses. Take out the rose-colored contacts and look at this with reality. Is there things we can learn from the future? I hope that I already answered that. Yes, we can learn not to let someone shame you for your thoughts or your ideas. If your thoughts or your ideas are going to hurt somebody, well, then they should, as I mentioned. But if your thoughts or ideas are, I really like the island culture, and when I see them do that ceremonial dance before they bury a warrior, my heart swells up with pride of just the fact that there is manhood left alive and on earth. Don't let anyone shame you for being manly. Don't let anyone shame you for being womanly. Don't let anyone shame you for being fiercely independent. You know, that said, I hope that I answered that question once again, but I do have one more for you, Britt, and this is something I had to think deeply before I even brung it up, because if anyone can give something good that's came from this, it will be you. So my question is to you, Britisher, how, if any way, if there's any way at all, how has the SJW movement made the world a better place?
Now I guess that would entirely depend on your interpretation, because much depends on what you ascribe to social justice. As I have said on other occasions, feminists like to claim credit for all manner of things, yet I would dispute that feminism had anything to do with women being granted the vote in my country. I think such claims are largely illusory. The gay rights movement clearly has achieved some equalities for homosexuals. It may be fair to say that by now they are overshooting the mark, but that is another issue. Interestingly, however, these things were achieved before really the catch-all of social justice became a widespread term. It is when they still operated as separate lobbies, rather than one giant leviathan. So on their own steam, some of the constituent parts could be said to have achieved something, but that was before they conjoined into this monstrous social justice entity. Since this concept of intersectionality has been embraced, I cannot see any good coming from it. In that regard, if you forgive me going off on a tangent again, it reminds me a bit of the TUC here in Britain. For those who do not know, the TUC is a trade union congress. Once a year, all the unions have a big get-together. They talk, they devise, they plan. But to me it has been hard to understand why they do this, other than for power. Trade unions fulfill a perfectly sound role in society. They seek to represent their workers, stop abuses and exploitation, and negotiate wage levels. All that seems completely comprehensible. But why would the firemen's union need to be at a conference with the railway conductors' union once a year? About what could they possibly talk? Of course, there is no practical purpose to it for the workers. It is instead a way of unions as institutions ganging together and exerting political power. That is where I see the parallels with social justice. The supposed intersectionality of these disparate groups is a nonsense. Feminism shares no common ground with transgender people, as has been amply demonstrated with some leading feminists of the old guard falling out with a new generation of intersectionalists. It is how Germaine Greer gets banned from speaking at universities for wrongthink. In a political sense, we also must consider that the social justice movement has quite literally destroyed the left. It hijacked the left, and in turn has caused voters to take flight. Now many on the right will feel quite pleased about that. They might think it is indeed social justice's greatest legacy, but I would caution people not to be overly optimistic at that outcome. Political systems need competition. They need opposition. A lengthy period in the Western world with a rampant right and a collapsed left might prove a very unhealthy thing, even for current supporters of the right. Meanwhile, of course, the education system remains the stronghold of social justice, not merely in the universities, but within the secondary and primary schools, and possibly even within the kindergartens. Of course, the regulatory bodies who oversee education will also be stacked to the gills with social justice personnel. It is this stranglehold on education which will prove very hard to dislodge. For one of their goals for sure is to continue churning out generation after generation of believers. So I think you can see I am struggling with your question, Mr. Ogre. I really struggle to identify the positives. They would no doubt cite Emmeline Pankhurst and Martin Luther King and so on, but that would be kidding themselves. Emmeline Pankhurst was a lunatic, and Martin Luther King would have had nothing to do with the social justice movement as it stands. Of that I am absolutely certain. If anything, he would have fought to separate the cause of black civil rights away from the clutches of this intersectional nightmare. Anyhow, I guess that concludes our little adventure in remote debating here. I would very much like to thank the mellifluous, though much too American, JT, aka the Laughing Ogre, for his questions and answers. It has been a pleasure. We must do this again sometime.
What a wonderful friend. Oh, I just want to thank the Britisher again. I'm not supposed to say too much. He told me a story of British soldiers, and I may have even said it earlier, and how they needed help, but they didn't want to ask for it in the Korean War. And so they were contacted, and the American commander was like, "How's it going over there, you British?" And the British commander said, "It's a wee bit sticky here, mate." And so the American commander thought that meant they were going to be okay, so they retreated. Well, the British were out of ammo, and they were throwing cans of corned beef at the Chinese so they would think that they were grenades. So I just want to say, I understand that you don't want me to just come out and kiss your butt. I'm not going to. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask everybody to not look up to me or to the Britisher or to Sargon of Akkad or to Tildeer or to vernaculus, I know, or to anybody else. Look up to them if you will, but don't set them in the place of your conscience or don't make them your thought process. Retain your own anonymity. Retain your own autonomy. And I thought of anonymity because most of those people are like myself, they're anonymous. But retain your own autonomy. Make your own decisions. Make those decisions based on a wealth and a multitude of counselors, but make those decisions for yourself. So hey folks, before you join a movement like Black Lives Matter or a feminist frequency, or again, I could go on and on and on and on and on. Before you join the Ku Klux Klan or the Nazi Party or the skinheads, ask yourself, do I really want to be a part of this? What is the end game? What will it do for society? Am I making the world a better place? If the answers to any of these questions make you squirm a bit, or if it makes you feel like I am not doing something good for society, please, brothers and sisters, think carefully about it. Remember, if what you do or say takes the rights of another human being away, you're no different than a Nazi or a fascist or a communist or anyone else, a lot of other ists that are out there trying to trample on the rights of humanity. Thank you once again, Britisher. I hope that we get a chance to do this again, and I hope every last one of you will stop by and see the Britisher on a daily basis, and hey, I humbly ask you to swing on by and check out the Laughing Ogre. I'll give you a little bit of music, I'll give you a little bit of politics, I'll give you a whole lot of crazy. God bless you, everyone.
Once again, dear viewers, you will find the link to the Ogre's channel in the notes below. I strongly recommend you visit his place once in a while and listen to what the Ogre has to say. Meanwhile, if I may, for those interested, the troops depicted in the intro are forces who were deployed in 1888 in an expedition in the mountainous terrain against the fierce Pathan tribes on the Indian northwest frontier, so Khyber Pass country. The first are magnificent Sikh soldiers. Those on the second picture are mustachioed Britishers of the Hazara Field Force. The officer in the centre was a colonel detached for this mission from a regiment of the renowned Nepalese Gurkhas. The fearsome-looking specimens of the last picture are officers of the famous Khyber Rifles. Are they not all glorious? Finally, the badge logo is my little spin on a later cap badge of the very Khyber Rifles. After all, we need to appear authentic, appear on the Cyber Pass, and stick to our theme. So Cyber Rifles it is for debates. For I regard all those up here, where the air is thin, fighting off the madness beyond the pass, as part of the garrison forces. We are all Cyber Rifles, and we better stick together, or the crazed blue-haired Pathans with their nose piercings and special pronouns will tear us limb from limb. Hence, all debates I put together will bear the Cyber Rifles badge. The personnel may differ from one debate to another, but the theme will remain the same, holding the cyber pass against the forces of insanity that want to cross it. So, ladies and gentlemen, my thanks to JT for taking part, and my thanks to you all for listening. That is all from the Cyber Pass for now. Thank you very much, and goodbye.